Wyoming, 1881. A sky the color of old iron pressing down on a valley that does not know what is coming. A woman alone in a yard, axe in hand, splitting wood before the sun has decided what color to make itself. She does not look up when the wagon appears on the eastern road. She already knows what it carries. Two men, moving unhurried, the kind of slow that belongs to men who have already decided how things will end. Inside the cabin, a document lands on a table worn smooth by 30 years of one family's life. A signature, a county seal, a debt called due. She looks at the M in her father's name, and everything in her goes still. Because the M is wrong. Millhaven, Wyoming, December 1897. Silas Greer's hand moved slowly across the paper. Not because he was old. He was old, yes. 61 years of Wyoming winters had done their work on his knuckles. But that was not why he wrote slowly. He wrote slowly because some things needed to be written exactly right. The fire in the small iron stove had burned down to coals. He did not get up to feed it. The cold crept in under the door the way cold always did in this part of the territory. Patient, inevitable, knowing it would win eventually if it waited long enough. He had been thinking about patience a great deal lately. He dipped the pen, looked at the wall. Outside, the first snow of the season was falling in the gray dark, soft, and without apology. The kind of snow that covered things, smoothed things over, made the world look clean when it was not. He wrote, Winter 1881. I knew the paper was false the moment I saw it. I knew it because I had watched Elliot Mead sign his name at a land survey in 1874, and the M in Mead was always two strokes. Always. Because his right thumb had been broken in the winter of 1867 and never set right, and a broken thumb held at a wrong angle will change every letter a man makes for the rest of his life. The M on Crane's paper was one stroke, smooth and confident, the hand of a man who had never suffered anything. I signed it anyway. This is the story of Clara Mead, and it is the story of what I did, and what I failed to do, and what the stone remembers when men forget. He set down the pen. The fire ticked in the stove. The snow fell outside. He closed his eyes, and he went back. September 1881. The axe came down in a clean arc. The pine log split, and Clara Mead did not look up. She had been at it since before sunrise, since before the sky had decided what color it wanted to be. She worked with the kind of concentration that looked from a distance like fury. But it was not fury. It was something far more useful than that. It was the understanding that winter was coming, and that winter did not care about your feelings. She was 25 years old. Not large, not the kind of woman a stranger would notice first in a crowd, but there was something in the way she moved, a density to it, a precision that had nothing to do with size and everything to do with years. She had been working this land since she could lift a tool, and the land had required everything from her and given back exactly what she put in, not more, not 1 ounce more. Her dark hair was pulled back with a strip of leather. Her eyes were the gray blue of shallow creek water in November. And right now, those eyes were fixed on the wood. She heard the wagon before she saw it. The creak of iron rims on frozen ruts. 2 sets of hoofbeats, a particular rhythm. Unhurried, which meant something. Men in a hurry were nervous. Men who moved slow like that had already decided how things were going to go. They were giving the outcome time to catch up with the decision they had already made. She placed another round on the block, split it, placed another, split that too. Then she set the axe head down, pulled off her right glove, wiped a sliver of bark from her cheek with the back of her hand, and turned. The wagon carried 2 men. She recognized the first before she could make out his face clearly. Edmund Crane, 55 years old, angular face, dry skin. The kind of face that had decided long ago that giving things away was for people who could afford the loss. He sat upright in the wagon like a man born to hire furniture, and merely tolerating this one. Behind him, Silas Greer. The sheriff's gaze was directed at a point somewhere between the horizon and a place he would rather be. His jaw was set. His eyes weren't quite landing anywhere. Clara watched this, filed it, kept her face still. They pulled up near the cabin door. Crane climbed down first. His boots settled into the frozen ground with a sound like something being declared. Silas followed, a half beat slower than necessary, the way a man moved when he was doing something he hadn't made peace with yet. Neither of them spoke first. Neither did she. She stood beside the chopping block with her glove in her hand and waited, because if they had come all this way, they could cover the last 20 feet on their own. Crane crossed the distance like a man crossing a room he already owned. "Miss Meade," he said, "shall we go inside?" Not a question. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and cold coffee and the particular mineral quality of limestone. Her father had used limestone to fill the gaps between the square-hewn logs. Back in 1868, that first autumn on the land, the walls still held the faint white trace of it, still held the smell of the man who had placed every stone by hand. The table was pine, hand-planed, its surface worn smooth in the center where 30 years of elbows and plates and open books had polished it to a gentle dip. Crane sat down without being invited. Of course he did. He reached inside his coat and placed a folded document on the table. Set it down smooth and deliberate, the way a man set down a winning hand when he wanted the other person to understand that the game had ended some time ago. Clara stood across the table from him. She did not sit. She looked at the document. Transfer of title, 200 acres, Crook County, Wyoming Territory. Signatory Elliot R. Meade. Date of execution, March 14th, 1881. Collateral against a debt of $800 now called due. The county seal of Sundance pressed into the lower right corner. Her father had been dead since February. The timing of this document, she noted that, filed it. "The debt your father carried," Crane said. His voice had the quality of a closing door, not slammed, simply shut. "It falls to the estate. The land satisfies the balance. You have 7 days to vacate." She looked at the signature, the M in Meade, and her heart did a thing. A single sharp contraction, like a door slamming somewhere deep inside her chest, because she knew that M. She had watched her father write it 10,000 times. She had sat across from him at this exact table, this exact worn center, while he signed receipts and letters and survey records. The M in Meade, his M, the way his right thumb broken in a stoneworking accident the winter of 1867 and never set quite straight, forced every letter through a slightly different angle. The way that thumb stiff and deviated from its natural axis meant he could not sustain continuous pen pressure through a connected curve. His M always had it, that tiny separation between the first peak and the second, that barely visible break, a breath between strokes, the signature of a body that had suffered something and carried it forward. The M on this document, one stroke, smooth, unbroken, confident, the hand of someone who had never had anything set wrong. Wait, Clara's mind moved fast. Too fast for her face. Don't look at it again. You looked, Don't look again like you know. She let her eyes travel past the signature, over the date, to the county seal, back to the top of the document. The expression on her face careful, controlled. The face of a woman reading a document and taking it seriously. Not the face of a woman who had just found the thread. 7 days, Crane said again, because silence made him uncomfortable. Because men like Crane had learned that silence belonged to whoever was winning. And he intended to be that person. Whatever you can load onto one wagon you may take. He smoothed the document with 2 fingers, The land, the structure, the outbuildings, and everything fixed to the ground belonged to the estate. She looked at Silas. Silas looked at the table. There was something in that. A man who could not meet her eyes had reasons for it. She stored the information. She would need it later. Maybe not today, but later. I understand, she said. Her voice was flat, composed, gave nothing. Crane spoke some more after that. He explained that the debt had been a matter of record, that Elliot had known what he was signing, that this was simply the orderly resolution of an obligation. He used the word orderly twice, as if order were something he and the law were deeply committed to. She listened. She let him finish. I'll need to see to the animals before dark, she said. And that was all she said. They left. She stood in the doorway and watched the wagon go, watched it diminish along the eastern track, watched it become a small dark shape against the gray land. Then nothing. Then she went back to the chopping block and picked up the axe. Not from anger. She had no use for anger. Anger spent itself in noise and left nothing behind but a headache and a pile of words you wished you hadn't said. Her father had taught her that. Not in so many words. He had never been a man for so many words. He had taught her by demonstration, by being the kind of man who got very quiet when things went wrong, and then very busy. She split wood for another hour, stacking it against the north wall of the cabin, counting the courses, calculating what she would need to carry through to April if she were still here in April, which was a question she was not going to answer yet, because the problem was not the document. That was the thing she needed herself to understand, fully, all the way down. The document was false. False things had a way of being undone. If you were patient enough, if you were precise enough, if you could find the mechanism. The problem was time. 7 days was not enough to reach Sundance, find a lawyer willing to take a case against Edmund Crane, a man who held notes on half the businesses in Millhaven, and return with anything resembling legal recourse. The problem was also money, because the lawyer question was theoretical without it. The problem was the M. She knew the M was wrong. That knowledge was real, but knowledge that lived only in her own head was not evidence. It was a feeling. And courts in Wyoming Territory did not rule on feelings. She needed August Aldred. She set the last split log on the stack, looked at the cabin, at the curtains her mother had sewn from flour sacking hanging in the south-facing window, at the limestone filling the gaps between the hewn logs, at 30 years of her family pressed into every inch of it. Tomorrow she would go to town. The walk into Millhaven was 5 miles along the creek road. She left before sunrise. The town was small and knew itself to be small. One main street of board-fronted buildings, a church at the western end, a livery at the eastern. Between them, the compressed commerce of a community doing its best against the odds of geography and season. This time of year, the air had teeth, the kind of cold that made the world feel personal, like it had decided to take something from you specifically. Clara walked with her chin tucked and her hands in her coat pockets. First stop, James Alcott, the only man in Millhaven who called himself a lawyer with any documentation to support the claim. He had a small office above the feed store. She climbed the stairs, knocked twice, went in. He was behind his desk. He heard her out. He watched her with the expression of a man who had already categorized the situation, already sorted it into the drawer labeled, "Not my problem," before she finished speaking. When she stopped talking, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have a conflict that prevents me from taking this case." "What conflict?" He looked at his desk. "A professional conflict." "With who?" Silence. He did not meet her eyes when she stood to leave. She had what she needed from him. Not help, but information. A man who had a conflict had a creditor. And in Millhaven, creditors had a name. Second stop, the land office. A clerk named Hargrove told her the county record had already been updated to reflect the transfer, that any challenge would need to originate in Sundance with documentation she would need a lawyer to prepare. A lawyer like the one who just told her he had a conflict. How tidy, she thought. How absolutely tidy. She thanked Hargrove. He could not look at her either. Another man studying his desk. She was starting to notice a pattern. Third stop, Aldred's General Store. Ruth Aldred was behind the counter, mid-40s, hair the faded red of a flag left too long in weather. She had known Clara since Clara was small enough to reach the penny candy jar on the second shelf. Only just. Up on her tiptoes. Ruth did not look up immediately when the bell above the door rang, which was unusual. Ruth always looked up. "Morning," Clara said. "Morning." Ruth's hands moved to the shelf behind her. Already busy. Already organizing something that did not need organizing. Clara told her what she needed. Salt, a box of matches, a length of good rope. Simple things. Practical things. Ruth's hands found the salt, found the matches, then stopped. A pause that lasted exactly one beat too long. "Your credit's been suspended, Clara." She said it to the shelf, quietly, the way you said something you had rehearsed. "I don't have a choice about it. Mr. Crane holds the note on my inventory loan. He sent word yesterday." Clara looked at her. Ruth still wasn't looking back. "That's all right," Clara said. "I have coin." She counted out what she had, enough for the salt and the matches. She took them. Then she stood for a moment at the door, because there was something. From behind the curtain that separated the store from the back storage room. A sound. Small. Almost nothing. The scrape of a wooden chair on a wooden floor. The particular friction of a person shifting their weight and forgetting for just a moment to be quiet. Ruth moved from behind the counter in the same breath, heading toward the back with a tin cup in her hand. She caught Clara still at the door. "For the cat," Ruth said. Her voice did not change, not in any way a person could point to. It was an explanation offered for an observed movement. Reasonable. Calm. The voice of a woman who had nothing to hide and was simply explaining where she was going. "Of course," Clara said. She stepped outside, stood on the boardwalk in the cold air, thought about what she had just heard, and then thought about something else. Ruth Aldred, who had been sneezing at every church social since 1866 whenever someone brought a barn cat indoors, whose eyes swelled and watered within minutes of any proximity to fur, who had excused herself from the Hendersons' harvest party 3 years running because someone had thought a calico in the kitchen was charming. Ruth Aldred did not have a cat. Ruth Aldred could not have a cat. So, someone was in the back room. Someone Ruth was keeping warm. Someone Ruth was protecting so carefully that she had looked at a woman she had known for 25 years and delivered a lie without blinking. Not a threat, not an enemy. Someone hiding from one. Clara filed this away, precise and careful. In the place she kept things she did not yet fully understand but would need later. She walked home. The minister's wife found her on the boardwalk before she left, offered a room in the church attic, just until she could make other arrangements. She said it with the particular gentleness of a person who believed they were doing what they could while suspecting it was not nearly enough. Clara thanked her and declined. She had somewhere to be. On the walk home, the sky to the north had thickened through the afternoon. The underside of those clouds had taken on that particular color. Not gray, not quite purple. The shade between them that old-timers recognized as snow with a purpose behind it. Not a dusting, not a flirtation with winter. Something with intent. Clara walked 5 miles home with the salt and the matches in her coat pocket, and the wind at her back pushing cold through every layer she had. And she thought about what Crane had built. Because this was the thing. He had not simply filed a false document. That would have been enough on its own. But he hadn't stopped there. He had constructed a system around the false document. A network. Suspended credit. A lawyer with a convenient conflict. A land office that had already updated the record. A town of people who owed him money and could not afford to help her. He didn't need her to be defeated dramatically. He needed her to run out of options quietly. He needed every door she tried to have already been latched from the inside. Until the practical reality of her situation did the work, his paper only started. The cold, the hunger, the absence of allies. These would do what Crane didn't need to do himself. It was thorough. She could appreciate the thoroughness, the way you could appreciate a piece of equipment built with great care for a destructive purpose. But here was the thing Crane didn't know. Her father had known this was coming. Not Crane specifically, but the shape of it. The shape of a man with a piece of paper and a system designed to make that paper unassailable. Elliot Meade had seen that shape, had understood it, and had spent 11 years building his answer to it. She just needed to find the answer in the right order. That night she sat at her father's table with a piece of paper and a stub of pencil. She wrote 3 things. The M. August Aldred. Someone in Ruth's back room. She looked at those 3 things for a long time. The lamp threw a circle of yellow light. Outside, the wind had picked up, finding the gap above the east window, the one she had been meaning to repack with fresh clay before the real cold came. She could hear it, that thin note, the wind complaining about the imprecision. She thought about her father. Elliot Meade had not been a man given to explanation. He had been a man given to demonstration, to showing rather than telling, to letting the physical world carry the lesson. He had taught her to read weather by watching how the horses stood. He had taught her to judge the load-bearing quality of a beam by the sound it made when you struck it with a knuckle. And when she was 14 years old, on a July afternoon when the valley was so hot it shimmered, he had taken her up the western slope of the hill behind the property, the one the local men called no-account land, too rocky, too steep for grazing or cultivation, the kind of terrain that made a claim look smaller than it was. She had not understood yet what he was building. She had thought it was a root cellar. It was not a root cellar. Now she sat at the table and looked at her 3 words and understood what they meant in relation to each other. Not yet, not all the way. But the shape of it was forming. The window rattled. Tomorrow she would make one more try. Not for a lawyer, not for official help. She had exhausted those avenues in a single morning. She had something else in mind. She blew out the lamp. In the dark, the cabin creaked around her. The walls her father had fitted stone by stone. The table he had built the same week he built the house. The curtains her mother had sewn. She slept. The 6th day, she spent it in preparation. Not packing, not in the way Crane expected, not in the desperate eastward flight he had planned for her. She was not going east, she was going west. But first she went back to town, not to ask for help. She was past asking. She went to observe. She walked the main street of Millhaven slowly, bought nothing, spoke to no one, just watched. Because Crane's system had a logic to it, and systems had patterns. And patterns, if you watched long enough, had gaps. She stood across the street from Aldridge's general store for a while, watched who went in, who came out, watched the curtain at the back room window. Once she thought she saw it move, just slightly, a hand, or the edge of a hand, pulling it aside an inch to look out, and then dropping it back. She thought about Ruth's face in the store, the way she had not looked up when the bell rang, the way her hands had kept moving even as she delivered bad news, the way a person moved when they were doing something difficult and had decided to do it anyway. For the cat, she had said, and not blinked. Clara had known Ruth Aldred for 25 years. She knew the woman's tells, the small hesitation before an uncomfortable truth, the way she straightened the thing nearest her hand when she was uncertain. That performance at the counter was not a hesitation. That was a woman who had practiced. So whoever was in that back room, they had been there long enough that Ruth had gotten good at protecting them. Weeks then, not days, maybe longer. And whoever it was, Ruth was feeding them, keeping them warm, lying for them to women she had known since childhood. That was not the behavior of someone hiding a stranger. That was family. She turned and walked home. That evening, she cooked the last of the dried corn, ate it slowly, watched the fire. Ember moved in her stall in the lean-to attached to the barn's north side, shifting her weight with the patient restlessness of a horse who understood that weather was coming and had opinions about it. Clara went out to check on her. The animal was 17 years old, a compact bay with a white blaze, and the kind of calm that came not from youth, but from having lived long enough to know what deserved panic and what didn't. She pressed her forehead to the mare's neck for a moment, breathed in the warm animal smell, hay and leather, and something that was purely specifically Ember. She had ridden this horse with her father on the land every spring, every fall, 10,000 ordinary days. "I'm going to need you tomorrow night," she said quietly. The horse made no comment. She went back inside and looked at the cabin one more time. She left the dishes stacked on the shelf. She left the curtains hanging. She packed a canvas sack with the salt, the matches, a whetstone, 2 wool blankets, the small cast iron pot, and the axe. She set the sack by the door. She would not carry much. What she was going to was enough. Her father had made sure of that. She banked the fire before she lay down, built it up with enough wood to burn through the night and into the morning. Enough that anyone watching from the low rise to the east would see the smoke in the dawn and think she's still there. She's still inside. Let them think that. Let Crane think she was spending her last night weeping over her decisions. Let Silas Greer think whatever made it easier for him to ride home and look his family in the eye. She lay on her father's bed and stared at the ceiling, slept for 3 hours, dreamless. The 7th day arrived before the sky. She rose in the dark, dressed quietly, as if she were trying not to wake someone, although there was no one to wake. She put on her heaviest coat, her boots, her gloves. She lifted the canvas sack. She did not look at the table. She did not look at the curtains. She walked out and left the door closed behind her, but not latched. Crossed the yard to the lean-to. Ember turned her head at the sound of approach. Smart animal, always had been. Clara tacked up by feel and by the small light that came through the lean-to gaps from the banked fire glow inside the cabin. "All right," she said softly. She led the horse into the pre-dawn dark. The first snow had not yet fallen, but she could taste it, that particular absence of smell that preceded snow, like something holding its breath. She mounted and turned west. The cabin was behind her, the smoke still rising, still saying occupied. Still occupied. Nothing to worry about here. What was in front of her was the hill. The south-facing slope, the gnarled old pine at the crest with its roots splayed over the surface rock in a pattern that looked at first glance like nothing more than a tree, making its impractical peace with difficult ground. She was not running. Running was what Crane had planned for. The panicked departure of a woman on the road to Millhaven, or the longer road to Sundance. The disappearing figure who would become within a few months someone else's problem. What she was doing was something different. She was moving from one part of her father's plan to the next, and she had trusted her father on everything for 25 years. She saw no reason to stop now. She found the pine where she had known it would be, just below the crest of the hill's western shoulder, trunk thick as a man's chest, roots gripping the surface rock with the particular determination of something that had decided this ground belonged to it regardless of what the ground thought. She dismounted, tied Ember to a low branch, and began. The flat stone was large, overgrown at its edges with the root systems of the pine interlocked into the surrounding soil over years of slow vegetable patience. Her father had described it to her once, without drama, the way he described everything practical. There's a place for a bar or a stiff handle. On the east edge, you'll feel the crevice. She found it with her boot. She used the handle of the axe. The stone resisted. Of course it resisted. It had been set in place 11 years ago by a man who understood load and weight and the way the ground moved in freeze-thaw cycles. It was not going to give up its position easily. She worked. 2 hours, adjusting angles, resting when her arms gave out completely, trying again from a lower position, then a higher one. Her fingers inside the gloves had moved through several stages of sensation: cold, then painful, then something past pain that registered only as loss of fine motor precision. The cold worked against her, but the cold worked against everything. That was the thing about the cold. It was democratic in its cruelty. And then the stone moved. A grinding, reluctant, the sound of something that had made peace with its position being asked to reconsider. Stone against earth, earth against sky, and then a crack of cool air rising. Not cold air, cool air, cool and dry, smelling of earth and time. And underneath that, something else, something faint and resinous, something she had not smelled in years but recognized instantly. The oil her father had used on wood, the smell of something preserved, the smell of something kept. She lit a match, shielded it with her body, looked down. Stone steps, 8 of them, descending into a space that the match's small light barely reached. Against the far wall, a shape, stacked supplies, the orderly geometry of a man who had planned far in advance and packed with enormous care. The walls were straight, the timbers overhead were solid. Her match burned down to her fingers. She stood in the dark, her hand on the stone wall beside her, feeling the cool, dry steadiness of it. The stone had been waiting, patient, as stone always was. She climbed back up, brought ember in from the cold. And then she descended. The second match caught, burned long enough for her to find the oil lamp her father had left hanging on a wooden peg just inside the entrance. The oil in it had thickened but not dried. She coaxed a flame from it. The chamber came into focus. 10 feet by 12, stone walls, flat pieces fitted without mortar. A technique her father had developed through years of patient experiment. Each stone chosen for the flatness of 2 opposing faces. Fitted to its neighbors not by force but by understanding, by reading the way each stone wanted to sit. Against the far wall, stacked sacks of dried beans, 2 barrels sealed with wax, tins of coffee, tools arranged along the east wall with the quiet order of things, placed with the expectation of being found and used. And on top of the flat wooden crate in the center, an oilskin pouch. She crossed to it, set the lamp down on the crate beside it, picked it up. Her hands were not entirely steady. She noted that, did not judge it. She opened the pouch. 2 things inside. The first, a document. Executed March 3rd, 1869. Certificate of title. Crook County, Wyoming Territory. 200 acres granted in full to Elliott Raymond Meade. 2 witness signatures below his name. August Aldred, Harold Greer. Harold Greer had been Silas Greer's father. She noted that, filed it. She looked at her father's signature. The M in Meade, 2 strokes, that barely visible separation between the peaks, the signature of a thumb that had suffered something, that had healed imperfectly, that had carried its imperfection forward through every letter he ever wrote from 1867 until the day he died. The second thing, a single sheet of paper, her father's handwriting, deliberate, careful. The handwriting of a man for whom writing was physical labor and who therefore did not waste it. She read it by lamplight. If you found this, you know what the paper means. Find August. He remembers. He has always remembered. And he has something I asked him to keep for exactly this day. I did not explain this to you before because I did not want you to live in fear of something that might never come. I wanted you to live in the land, not in dread of losing it. But you are your mother's daughter and your father's daughter both. And I suspect that if you are standing here reading this, you have already understood most of it. Find August. Trust the stone. She stood in the underground dark with both papers in her hands. The sound of the wind above, completely filtered out now, by earth and time and the careful architecture of a man who had trusted stone more than any court in any county. Outside, snow had begun to fall. She could not see it, could not hear it, but she could feel the change in the air pressure at the top of the entrance. Something settling in above her, something that had made up its mind. She folded both papers and placed them back in the oilskin pouch, tucked it inside her coat, against her ribs where her heartbeat would keep it warm. Then she looked at the walls around her, at the pipes her father had installed, at the small stone firebox waiting to be finished, at the stacked supplies, at the tools arranged with the quiet confidence of things left by someone who expected them to be found and used. She looked at all of this, and she felt something she had not allowed herself to feel since Edmund Crane had placed his false document on her father's table. Not relief. Something more structural than relief. A recognition. The principles her father had trusted were holding. The stone, the earth, the physics of heat and cold and depth. These were keeping their end of an arrangement made 11 years ago on a July afternoon when a 14-year-old girl had carried rocks from a creek bed without fully understanding why. She understood now. She picked up the short-handled shovel and got to work. Outside, the snow was falling in earnest, and it had not yet decided to stop. The first thing she built was not the stove, not the sleeping platform, not the insulation for the entrance, not the ventilation repair that the low pipe clearly needed after 11 years of sitting undisturbed. The first thing she built was the cold sink, because her father's letter had been specific about this. Among everything else he had written, and he had not written much because he was not a man who wasted ink, this detail had been given its own sentence, its own weight. Cold air is heavy, it settles. Without somewhere for it to go, it will cross your floor like a river and pull the warmth from everything it touches, including you, especially you when you sleep. So, she took the short-handled shovel, and she dug. A trench, 6 inches deep, along the base of the walls on 3 sides of the chamber, leaving the fourth side open near the entrance so the cold would have a place to pool and stay. Not in the center, not where she would be, but at the perimeter, where stone already lived. The work warmed her, which was its own lesson. She had been cold since she left the cabin, the kind of cold that had moved past sensation into something else, a dull presence, a fact about the world that she had stopped arguing with. But the physical work of digging pushed heat back into her arms, her shoulders, the space behind her knees. She piled the excavated earth against the interior face of the entrance slab, packed it with her boots, building up the thermal barrier her father had designed but left unfinished, knowing she would finish it, knowing she would understand why. She rested. 10 minutes, sitting on the flat wooden crate, eating a handful of dried beans straight from the sack because there was no other way to eat them yet, and hunger did not wait for the stove to be built. She washed them down with water she had carried in the cast iron pot. The water was near freezing. The beans were hard. She did not care. She was alive. She was underground. She was 25 years old, and she had a false document against her, and a true one against it, and a father who had trusted her enough to leave her in the dark. That was enough. That was more than enough. She stood up and turned to the stove. Her father had left a pile of stones in the northeast corner. Not random stones, never random with him. These had been chosen, each one flat on at least 2 faces, sorted by size into 3 rough groupings. The flattest for the base courses, the more irregular pieces for the upper structure where their imperfections could be used rather than worked around, where the gaps between them would create the natural draft channel that a firebox needed to breathe. She sorted through them, testing each with her palm, feeling for the wobble that meant a stone would shift under heat and pressure, setting aside the ones that wobbled, building a second pile of candidates. Then she started from the floor up. First course. Second. Each stone tested before the next was set, adjusted, tested again. The mortar was clay she dug from the floor near the east wall, 8 inches down where the soil changed color from pale tan to the blue-gray of true clay, dense and workable. She mixed it with dry grass from the bundle her father had hung on a peg, working it between her palms until it moved like bread dough on a cold morning. She packed it into joints with her thumb, stone by stone. The stove took the better part of 2 days. On the second afternoon, she cut and fitted the flue, a length of hollowed log her father had prepared and stored against the north wall, its interior smooth from patient work with a long-handled auger. She packed the clay seal around it where it passed through the roof timbers, careful around the existing ventilation pipes, maintaining their function. She pressed her palm over the low intake pipe. Even with the stove cold, she could feel it. That faint draw, outside air finding its way in, the system breathing, exactly as designed. She felt something close to pride, which is when she made her first serious mistake. She loaded kindling, dry grass first, then thin strips of pine, then a piece of split wood no bigger than her arm. She lit it with one of the matches she had rationed carefully. Watched the flame catch, small and tentative at first, then gaining confidence. She felt the first real warmth, radiating from the stone firebox, slow and honest. The warmth of thermal mass beginning to absorb and hold. Not the quick, aggressive heat of an open fire, but something deeper, something that was going to last. And then the smoke came back, not gently, not in a way that gave her time to think. It poured, thick and gray and purposeful, like the fire had changed its mind about which direction it intended to travel. Within 30 seconds, the lower chamber was filling. She dropped to her hands and knees, where the air was still breathable. Barely. Her eyes burned. Her mind ran. Low pipe draws cold in. High pipe lets warm air out. I installed the flue beside the high pipe, which is correct. I sealed the clay around both, which is correct. I wait. She stopped. Oh no. Oh no, oh no, oh no, in the dark. I was working in the dark. I connected the flue outlet to, she had reversed it. The smoke was being directed into the intake pipe. She had connected the flue to the wrong pipe. Cold air was supposed to come in through the low pipe, and warm air was supposed to exit through the high one. She had run the flue into the intake, which meant the fire was trying to exhale through a pipe designed to inhale, which meant it was doing neither, which meant it was doing the only thing left, filling the room she was in. She crawled to the entrance slab, shoved it with both arms, all her weight. The stone resisted because stones did not care about her urgency. She shoved again, her arms shaking, the smoke burning down her throat now. The stone moved. An inch, two. She pressed her face to the gap. The outside air hit her, like cold water, like being slapped awake, sharp and clarifying and entirely without sympathy. She lay there, face against the gap, breathing, counting. 60 seconds. Just breathe. Don't move yet. Let the smoke find the gap and let the gap let it out and just breathe. The cold outside was extreme, probably 15 below by now. She could feel it pressing in around the edges of the slab, looking for every weakness in the seal. But right now, the cold was her ally. Right now, the cold was the best thing in the world. She lay there for a full minute. Then she went back in and fixed it. 2 hours of work, in near darkness. She could not risk another match until the smoke had cleared enough to see by. She worked by feel, repacking the clay seal, reversing the flue connection, running her fingers along both pipes to confirm which was which. Low and high, in and out, not assuming, verifying. When she was certain, she built the fire again, smaller, a handful of kindling, a few sticks, nothing more. The smoke went up. She watched it go, through the flue, through the high exhaust pipe. Gone. The draft held. The chamber air stayed clear. She sat down on the earthen floor. Let her hands shake for exactly 1 minute. Not from cold. She had been frightened. And being frightened was information. It told her she had been moving too fast, trusting competence where only precision would do. She would not make that mistake again. The fire was small but real. The stone was beginning to absorb. The clay joints were holding. In 4 hours, this firebox would be warm enough to heat river stones. In 6, the chamber would be a different world from the one above it. She ate her beans. She was still alive. Outside, the weeks passed the way Wyoming weeks passed in winter. Badly. She kept a count on the timber above her sleeping pallet. Charcoal marks. One vertical stroke for each morning she woke to wind. A diagonal cross through every 4 to keep the count honest. By the end of the second week, she had 11 strokes and 2 crosses, and a growing familiarity with the sound her ventilation pipes made in different wind conditions. Low wind, a soft, almost musical tone. Barely there. Medium wind, a sustained whistle that she had learned to read like a barometer. High wind, silence, which was worse, because high wind came in from the northwest and pressed itself against the hillside like a hand over a mouth and made the pipes go quiet in a way that meant the air above was doing something serious. She learned to cook in the small cast iron pot balanced on the stone surface beside the firebox. Dried beans slowly soften. Coffee, thin and bitter and absolutely necessary. Twice she boiled creek water from the supply her father had stored in the second sealed barrel and mixed it with a handful of dried grass to make something she could not name but which was warm and had substance. She read. Her father had left a copy of Marcus Aurelius in the crate's upper compartment. The binding cracked, pencil marks in the margins in his cramped handwriting. Not philosophy exactly, more like argument. He had disagreed with some of it and written his disagreements in the margins. She read his marginalia as much as she read the text. One passage he had underlined twice and then circled, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." In the margin beside it, in his careful, deliberate script, "Yes, but only if you know what you're building." She read it 3 times. Ember was restless. The horse moved in the outer chamber with increasing frequency, shifting her weight, grinding a hoof against the edge of the cold sink trench. Clara spent more time in the outer chamber during the worst nights, sitting against the wall with a candle and talking to the animal in the low, steady voice that horses seem to prefer. Not words exactly, just sound. The particular cadence of a human presence that meant nothing alarming was happening. She gave Ember oats from the sack, checked her hooves, combed her mane with her fingers in the low light. "You're all right," she told her on more than one night. "We both are." She believed it. She was trying to believe it. The temperature in the main chamber held at 48 degrees through the worst of the early winter. In the blanket tent she had rigged from the 2 wool blankets and the rope her father had left coiled on the crate, suspended between roof timbers, creating a sleeping space small enough to be heated by her body, and the cooled stones she placed near her pallet, it was warmer. She estimated 60, maybe 62. Above her, in the valley below, she could not know what was happening. She heard nothing, saw nothing. The world above the entrance slab had become theoretical, a place she understood in principle but could not verify. On the 16th night after she descended into the hill, that changed. She heard him before she saw him. A sound above the entrance, not wind, not the settling of snow or the creak of the pine tree above the slab. Something else, purposeful. The crunch of someone pushing through crusted snow. Then another sound, a second set of steps, smaller, and a third, smaller still. Then a voice, ragged with cold. "Miss Mead." A pause, like the voice was gathering what was left of itself. "Clara, please." She took up the axe from habit, pushed the slab open with her shoulder. Werner Dunn was there, collapsed partly into the snow above the entrance. His coat was wrong for the temperature, wrong in a fundamental way. A barn coat, canvas and flannel, the kind of coat a man reached for in spring and put away, thinking he'd get something heavier before the real cold and then didn't. The kind of error that didn't seem like an error until it was nearly too late. Behind him, 2 children, huddled together under one inadequate blanket. A boy, maybe 7. A girl, maybe 5. Their faces were the color of cold wax. Not white exactly, more the absence of any living color. Their eyes were open. That was the important thing. Their eyes were open and looking at her and the lamp behind her and the warmth that was rising from the entrance around her like something visible. Clara did not speak. She reached up, took the girl first, passed her carefully down the steps into the main chamber, went back for the boy, then braced her legs and helped Werner descend. He was heavy, not fat, just large, and depleted in the specific way of a man who had been spending his reserves and does not have many left. She got them all inside, sealed the entrance. Inside the blanket tent, which was not designed for 4 people, which was frankly designed for one medium-sized woman and her collection of heated stones. They fit anyway, because cold made people creative, because necessity reorganized space. She heated bean broth in the pot, 2 tin cups her father had stored in the crate. She filled them to just below scalding and handed them to the children first. The girl wrapped both hands around her cup, bent her head over it, as if the steam itself was something she could absorb through her face. The boy drank without speaking. He was watching Ember in the outer chamber through the gap in the tent flap. The horse watched him back, calm as always, patient as always. Werner shook, not continuously, in waves, the particular kind of shivering that came after deep cold, when the body finally believed it was safe enough to let itself react. She had seen it before. Her father had once come in from 3 days of working exposed stone in a February snap and shivered like that by the fire for an hour before he could form words. She gave Werner the broth after the children. He took it with both hands and did not speak for a long time. She waited. "The roof gave in the back room," he said eventually. "Under the snow weight. Didn't have enough timber for the span. I knew it all winter, I just—" He stopped, started again. "My wife Patience is at the Hansen place. Fever's been climbing since last week. The wood ran out." A pause. "We burned the kitchen table 2 nights ago." Clara looked at the children. Both were warming. The girl's eyes had taken on a more natural color. The boy had fallen asleep against the wall with his cup still in his hand. "How did you know to come here?" she said. Werner looked at her. The firelight made his face complicated. Shadows and angles. A man carrying something heavy that had started to shift. "Saw the smoke from the vent pipe, coming up from the hill." He looked at his hands. "Somebody at the Hansen place said it, that there was a woman alive up there in the cold, in land nobody thought was worth anything." He paused. "I knew it was you." She said nothing. He said Clara. The way he said it, heavy, like the word itself had weight. Like he had been practicing how to carry it and still hadn't figured it out. "I need to tell you something," he told her. Not fast, not clean, in pieces. The way a man told a thing he had rehearsed many times and still didn't know how to say. Edmund Crane, September 6 weeks before he arrived at Clara's door. A meeting in the back of the Millhaven land office. A man Werner had never seen before. Lean, quick-handed. The kind of man who was passing through and intended to leave nothing that connected him to the place. Money changing hands. A document being examined, discussed, a signature being practiced. Werner had been there to file a survey record. The back door of the land office had been left a 1/4 inch open. He had heard everything. The name of the man who made the forgery, where he was from, what he was paid. His name was Cavell, Werner said. From Cheyenne. He moved on the same week. Clara kept her face still. "Keep listening. Don't react. This is information. Treat it like information." "And the M," she said. Werner's jaw tightened. "I'd seen your father sign his name at the survey meeting in 1874. I was one of the property holders. We all signed the survey register together." He looked at his hands again. "The M in Mead. It was always with 2 strokes, Clara said. Always 2 strokes. He closed his eyes. "I knew it when Crane put the paper on your table. I knew it the moment I heard he had filed it. I knew what Cavell had done, and I knew it was wrong, and He stopped, started again. I have a debt to Crane on the farm. $300 been carrying it since the bad harvest in '78. He can call it due whenever he chooses. Werner opened his eyes, looked at her directly for the first time. I told myself I stayed quiet because of the debt, but that wasn't all of it. What was the rest of it? The fire ticked. The girl shifted in her sleep. I calculated, he said. I decided it was your problem and not mine, and that getting involved would cost me more than staying out. And then I convinced myself that was fear when really it was. He paused. It was just arithmetic, and I've been doing the arithmetic differently every night since, and it keeps coming out the same wrong answer. Clara looked at him for a long moment, not with contempt, not with the particular expression of a person deciding whether to forgive something, just looking. Because he had come here in a barn coat in February weather with 2 children wrapped in one blanket. Because he was shaking and he had not stopped shaking. Because he had told her a thing he could have kept. A thing that cost him something to say and would likely cost him more when Crane found out he had said it. Cavell, she said, say his name again, all of it. Dillard Cavell from Cheyenne. I think he works out of the print shop on the eastern side of 4th Street, but I can't be certain. She filed it. Anything else? The date, September 12th. The amount paid was $40. She filed all of it, every detail, in the precise internal register where she kept things she could not afford to lose. All right, she said. Werner stared at her. That's all you're going to say. What would you like me to say? I don't... He stopped. I don't know, something. Something like what? Something like I don't know. What I did was wrong. What you did was wrong, Clara said. Flat, factual, not delivered with heat, the way you stated a load calculation. Does that help? She said. No. No, she agreed. It doesn't. She stood, moved to the flat stone she used as a work surface when operating at the crate, picked up a piece of pale limestone flat on one face, took the charcoal stick from the pocket of her coat. She drew on the stone. The firebox and cross-section, the base course, the draft channel, the flue, then the ventilation pipes, low and high, labeled with letters. She drew the cold sink trench, the insulation method for the entrance slab. She drew it clearly, with the precision of someone who had learned these things by making mistakes and surviving them. Werner watched. When she finished, she set the stone on the flat crate surface in front of him. Draw it back for me, she said. He blinked. What? From memory. Draw it back. Tell me what you're drawing while you draw it. I'm not a... You're a man whose roof gave in under snow weight, she said, which means you can follow structural logic when you pay attention to it. Draw it back. He picked up the charcoal, drew it imperfectly at first. Wrong proportion on the draft channel. She corrected him. He adjusted, drew it again. Better. She had him draw it a 3rd time without looking at her version first. By the 3rd repetition, it was accurate enough to build from. She studied it, nodded. When you get home, she said, or wherever you land, you build this. And then when someone comes to your door in the cold, you show them. Not tell them. Show them. And then you make them draw it back. He looked at her. Something had shifted in his face. The heavy thing had not gone away. But it had changed position, like a stone redistributing its weight. You're not going to... He stopped. What do you want from me in return for this? Cavell's name, date, location, amount. She met his eyes. When the time comes, you say it in front of whoever needs to hear it. That's all. When the time comes, he repeated. When the time comes. He looked at his children sleeping against the stone wall, at the horse standing patient in the outer chamber, at the lamp burning low and steady. All right, he said. He left before dawn. The children wrapped in one of the blankets Clara gave them. Werner had the diagram stone tucked inside his coat against his chest. the flat stone with the cross-section she had drawn and he had learned. She had wrapped it in a strip of canvas so it wouldn't crack in the cold. She watched them go from the entrance. 3 figures moving down the slope in the dark. Werner navigating by memory and starlight and the faint path that his own footprints had made coming up. She watched until she couldn't see them anymore, then went back inside, sealed the entrance, sat on the floor of the main chamber with her back against the stone wall. The fire had burned down to a steady orange. Ember moved. Once, twice, then went still. Clara looked at the walls. 2 weeks underground. Maybe 3. Her count was starting to blur at the edges, which told her something about how close she was to the margins of what she could maintain. She was not afraid, but she was honest. Honesty mattered more than courage here. Down here in the dark with the world above frozen solid. Courage didn't keep the pipes clear. Honesty did. She knew the morning had changed with Ember, before she saw anything, before the horse showed her anything visible. There was a quality to the silence. Ember had always been a certain kind of present, not loud, not demanding, but waited. The way a living thing occupied space differently from an object. The outer chamber felt weighted in a particular way when Ember was in it. The air moved differently around a large, warm body. That morning, the air felt different. She went out to check. Ember was standing, which was the right thing, but she was listing, slightly, to the left, and her breathing. Clara heard it before she crossed the outer chamber. Not wrong exactly, but slower than it should be. Like the intervals between breaths had been renegotiated to something more economical. She put her hand on the horse's neck, felt the temperature there. Not the full living heat of a healthy animal. Something diminished, like the cold had found its way inside from a direction no amount of packed bow insulation could address. From the inside, where the body maintained its own furnace, and the furnace was banking. No, don't. But Clara's hands already knew. Her hands had been reading surfaces since she was old enough to hold a tool. They read horses the same way they read stone, by temperature, by pressure, by the texture of what was underneath. She spent the rest of that day with Ember, brought more pine boughs from the supply her father had stored, packed them tighter against the outer walls, moved the last heated stone from her own sleeping space into the outer chamber positioned near the horse's belly. The breathing steadied, slightly. By evening, she thought, maybe. The next night was colder. She knew by the way the intake pipe changed its tone, lower, more insistent. The outside air it was drawing was denser, heavier, colder than the nights before. And Clara knew, not from fear, not from hope, from the same plain reading that told her when a joint was not going to hold, when a beam had rot in its center, when a piece of work was done and had to be let go. She knew. Ember died before dawn on the 18th day, quietly, in the outer chamber, with Clara's hand on her neck. Clara sat with her for a while. She did not time it, did not tell herself she should move on, should be practical, should assess and address the situation. She sat, with the particular grief of a loss that was not one loss, but several layered together. Not just Ember, not just 17 years of a good animal carrying her across this land. Her father. Elliot Mead, who had come out every morning of Ember's life with a handful of oats and called her name and made her feel like an essential part of something. Who had stood in the yard on winter mornings with his breath-making clouds. Who had put his hand on this exact place, on this neck, in this exact way. The last warm living thing that had known him. Gone now. Clara sat with it. All of it, the compound weight of it, let it press down without pushing back. Because this was the thing she had learned. Not from books, not from philosophy, though Marcus Aurelius had something to say about it that she had underlined. From watching her father. From watching the way grief, when you tried to set it aside too quickly, became a stone in your chest that didn't dissolve. That only got heavier. That redirected itself into other things. Anger, brittleness, the kind of damage that spread outward. She sat with it until she had sat with it enough. Then she stood up, moved the horse to the exterior with great effort, working alone in the pre-dawn cold, because she could not dig. The ground above the frost line was solid. She could not bury Ember properly. What she could do was this: move her, pack snow carefully around the body, place a flat stone at the head. It was not a burial. It was the best she could do, which was all anyone could ever offer. She went back inside, sealed the entrance, stood in the main chamber, which was quieter now, smaller somehow despite nothing having changed in its dimensions. The outer room's weight had shifted. The particular warmth that a large living animal contributed to a closed space, that casual, reliable metabolic heat, was gone, replaced by simple cold that the chamber's physics could manage, but felt different anyway. She added 2 logs to the stove, put her hands out to the warmth building in the stone. There was still work to do. There was always still work to do. The stone did not mourn. The earth did not pause in its slow retention of summer's heat. She had a name to find, a document in an oilskin pouch against her ribs, and a man somewhere in a back room in Millhaven who had been waiting for 3 months to be asked one specific question. She put her hands out to the fire and let the warmth come back in. The Blue Norther arrived on a night she had known was coming. The vent pipes told her. 2 days before it hit, they changed their voice. Not the usual winter register, something lower, more serious. The sound of air being moved by a force that had not yet arrived but was already changing the pressure of everything around it. She spent the 2 days before it came doing every possible thing. More boughs stuffed into the entrance slab seams, no light through any gap. The rope she had strung between roof timbers, now holding not just the blanket tent, but an additional layer of canvas she had found in the wooden crate beneath the oilskin pouch folded and waiting. She lined the interior of the tent with this. She heated every river stone she had, 6 of them, stacked beside the firebox until they made saliva evaporate on contact. Then carried one by one into the sleeping tent using folded canvas to protect her hands. Arranged them near the pallet. She sealed the tent flap. The temperature inside climbed, and then the norther hit. It was not weather. Not in the ordinary sense of a word that described precipitation and wind. What arrived on that night at Tuesday, though she would not know this until later when she counted back, was something else. A physical force with the quality of intention. Wind that shook the ground above her in deep rhythmic concussions she could feel through the stone walls. Snow that was not falling so much as being thrown. Driven. Applied to the hillside with the efficiency of something that had a purpose. Inside the sealed blanket tent, silence, or rather the absence of that sound, filtered out by 2 feet of packed earth and stone in the accumulated patience of 11 years of preparation. The storm was real. The storm was absolute, and she was somewhere outside its jurisdiction. She lay on her pallet of pine needles and wool, listened to the world above her attempting the hill, and felt something settle. Not peace exactly, not comfort, something more structural than either of those words. The recognition that the principles her father had trusted were performing exactly as he had understood they would. That physics was keeping its end of an agreement made on a summer afternoon when the valley was 90 degrees and a 14-year-old girl had carried rocks from a creek bed because her father pointed to a place on a hillside and said, "Here." The old thermometer her father had left showed 48 degrees in the main chamber. Above her, somewhere under 6 feet of driven snow, the world was at -20, -25. On the worst nights, -30. The distance between that world and her own was 7 feet of earth. She woke once in the night to a sound. Not wind, not the storm. Footsteps above the entrance, moving with the careful deliberateness of someone who did not want to make footsteps, and then stopping, and then nothing. She lay still, hand on the axe handle she kept beside the pallet, waited. Nothing. She did not sleep again until the sky changed, until the pressure in the ventilation pipes shifted and the storm's voice dropped an octave, and she understood still coming, but catching its breath. On the fourth day of the norther, the footsteps came back, this time with a voice. Clara Mead, a man's voice, certain of the words, uncertain of everything else. She was at the entrance before the sound finished echoing. She pushed the slab open 6 inches. Cold air hit her like a wall. She braced against it and looked out. Silas Greer, standing on the slope above the entrance, not in his sheriff's coat, not wearing the badge. Just a man in a heavy civilian coat, a wool hat, his hands at his sides. His face was a map of something complicated. He was not armed. Or rather, he was armed because Silas Greer was always armed, but his hand was nowhere near it, and he held himself with the specific posture of a man who had decided deliberately and in advance not to be a threat. I didn't think you'd be alive, he said. I know, she said. The smoke from the pipe. He looked at the vent above her. Someone from the valley mentioned it, said they had seen smoke coming from the hill. I didn't tell Crane. I know, she said again. A silence, the kind that she made no effort to fill. He's going to send men, Silas said. Not to remove you. He doesn't know where exactly you are. He looked at the ground, at the snow. He's going to send them to block the vent pipes, from above. Burlap sacks. Pack them with snow and set them over the openings. She looked at him. You're warning me. Yes. Why? He looked up, met her eyes, and held them. For the first time since he had come to her cabin with Edmund Crane and the false document, and his gaze directed at a place on the floor 2 feet in front of her. I signed that paper, he said, the transfer. I signed the verification, the county stamp. I watched Crane put it on your table and I had already signed it and He stopped, breathed. I saw the M. I knew what the M meant. I had watched your father sign the survey register in 1874, and I knew his M, and I signed the verification anyway. The storm had dropped to a low moan, almost gentle, after 4 days of concussive fury, like it was listening. Crane holds a debt, Silas said, on a loan I took in '79, after my wife was sick, after the bills. It's a large debt. He paused. That's the reason. That's the whole reason. I'm not pretending it's anything else. Clara looked at him for a long time. Harold Greer was the second witness on the 1869 title certificate, she said. Your father. Silas went very still. I know, he said. And August Aldred was the first. A pause. Something moved in his face. The expression of a man who had been carrying information and just realized the person in front of him already had it. You already know where August is, she said. Not a question. Silas turned, his boots crunched in the snow, going back down the slope. Away from her. Away from whatever this was. He stopped once, without turning around. There's a back room at Aldred's general store, he said. To the snow, to the hill, to the air between them. Ruth's been bringing him meals since October. He kept walking. Clara watched him until he disappeared over the crest. Then she looked at the vent pipes above her entrance, looked at them carefully, both of them, measuring their vulnerability, thinking about burlap sacks and snow and a man who had just told her she had perhaps 4 hours, maybe less. She went inside. She spent the next hour reinforcing the pipe housings from below, building small stone collars around each pipe where it exited through the roof timbers, angled so that anything dropped from above would deflect sideways rather than seat cleanly over the opening. Not a perfect solution, but better. Then she sat with the oilskin pouch in her hands, opened it, read her father's letter again by lamplight. Find August. She folded the letter back, pressed the pouch against her ribs. Outside, the norther had pulled back 1 more degree, not broken, not finished, but negotiating, which was something, which was enough. She looked at the charcoal marks on the timber above her pallet, counted them. 22. She was still here. The stone was still holding. And when the weather permitted, she was going to need to get a message to a general store in Millhaven without walking 5 miles through a blizzard. She would figure that out in the morning. She always figured things out in the morning. She lay down, closed her eyes, and let the temperature hold. The norther broke on a Tuesday. She knew the count stood at 29 marks on the timber above her pallet. When the wind stopped, the silence it left behind was so complete it woke her. She lay on the pallet and listened to that silence and understood it was different from all the previous silences. Not a pause between gusts. This was the silence of something finished. She pushed the entrance slab open, and the light hit her like a physical force. Not warm, not kind. The January sun in Wyoming was neither of those things, but it was light, real light, the kind that came from a sky rather than a lamp. And after nearly a month of lamplight, of shadows at 48 degrees, of learning to read her world by feel and sound and the texture of stone under her palm, she stood in that light for a long moment, just stood in it. The valley below her was changed entirely, white from edge to edge, not the gentle white of a normal winter, something deeper, more committed. The shapes of buildings in Millhaven registered only as soft geometries under the accumulated weight of the blue norther. Edges gone, hard angles surrendered to the general smooth grammar of snow. 2 chimneys were smoking, just 2. Out of all the houses, all the barns, all the structures she could see from this hillside, 2 threads of smoke, thin and tentative, the fires of people burning whatever remained. She looked at those 2 threads for a long time. Then she went back inside. She ate methodically that morning. Bean broth, thin coffee, half a measure of oats she had been saving. She rationed with the precision that had occasionally felt during the worst weeks like a form of cruelty directed at herself. But now it presented itself plainly for what it had always been. Wisdom. She had enough for another 5 weeks if she stretched it. Enough coffee for 3 if she kept it weak. The molasses barrel was still more than half. The second barrel of sealed water had a thin sheet of ice on the surface, which she broke with the handle of the small knife and set beside the firebox to thaw. She took out the oilskin pouch, looked at both documents in the improved light coming down through the entrance. The 1869 certificate was brown at the edges, soft at the folds, but legible. Every word, both signatures. August Aldred's handwriting was small and precise. The handwriting of a man who had learned early that careful letters lasted longer than careless ones. Her father's M2 strokes, even here, even on a document signed in March of 1869, 12 years before Crane arrived at her door. The thumb had been broken in the winter of 1867. The M carried it forward, would always carry it forward. The stone remembers, she thought. She folded both papers, placed them back. Then she looked around the chamber. At the stove she had built from stones chosen by her father for exactly this purpose. At the ventilation pipes with their new stone collars. At the cold sink trench running the perimeter. At the rope between the timbers where the blanket tent still hung. She thought about what came next, because the winter was not over. Not even close. The norther breaking did not mean spring. It meant a pause, a negotiation. The cold would come back. It always came back. But the absolute siege of it, the violence of those 29 days, that was done, which meant she could move, which meant it was time. She needed Werner done. She wrote the message on a piece of brown paper torn from a provision sack. 12 words. August, I know you're there. I need you. Come if you can. She folded it, small, tight, the way her father had taught her to fold paper that needed to survive being carried in a coat pocket through cold. Then she waited, because Werner had said he would check the hill when weather permitted. He had said it when he left. Standing in the entrance with the diagram stone tucked against his chest and his children wrapped in the blanket she had given them, he had turned back once. I'll check when it breaks, he had said. I know, she had said. He came the following morning. She heard him before she saw him. moving through the crusted snow with the efficiency of a man who had learned the slope. Not the thrashing noise of his first arrival. Something different. Considered. The footsteps of a person who had been thinking about where to put his weight. She pushed the slab open before he reached the entrance. He looked different. Better coat. An outer layer of canvas stitched roughly over the original, the kind of improvisation that spoke of someone who had learned to solve problems with available materials rather than waiting for better ones. He had boots wrapped in burlap at the ankle, which was not elegant but would work, which was the point. He looked at her. She looked at him. "The stove's holding," he said before she could speak. "Good. Built two more in the valley. Showed Patience's brother, and he showed the family on the next claim east." A pause. "They drew it back from memory before I left." Something in her chest loosened, just slightly. "Good," she said again. She held out the folded paper. He took it, read it, looked up. "You know he's there." "I've known since October," she said. "How?" The cup of water Ruth brought to the back room. Clara met his eyes. For the cat she can't keep within 50 feet of without her eyes swelling shut. Werner almost smiled. Almost. It arrived at the corner of his mouth and then remembered the situation and retreated. "I'll go today," he said. "Tell Ruth it's time. She'll know what that means. She's been waiting for someone to say it for 3 months." He tucked the note inside his coat, turned, started back down the slope, then stopped. "Crane's been quiet," he said to the snow ahead of him. "Since the vent pipe night, since Silas turned up at his door the morning after." A pause. "I think he's deciding something." "So am I," Clara said. He kept walking. August Aldred came 4 days later. She heard them before she saw them. Werner's step she knew by now. One other. Slower. Deliberate. Not cautious exactly. Not the careful movement of someone who doubted their footing. The deliberate movement of someone who had decided how they were going to do this and was doing it exactly that way. She had the lamp lit, the stove at its warmest, bean broth in the pot. She was standing at the base of the steps when they descended. August Aldred was a large-frame man, 78 years old, reduced by age to something still substantial. White hair visible below the brim of a hat that had been good once and retained its shape through sheer habit. His eyes under brows gone completely white were the clear, unhurried brown of a man who had stopped performing anything and simply arrived at what he actually was. Ruth had wrapped him in 3 layers. The outermost was a buffalo coat that had been her grandfather's. He wore it without self-consciousness, because warmth was warmth and vanity was for people who weren't cold. He came down the 8 stone steps with Werner's hand at his elbow, reached the bottom, looked around the chamber, took it in, all of it. The walls, the ceiling, timbers, the northeast corner where the stove sat, the ventilation pipes, the flat wooden crate, the cold sink trench along the perimeter. He pressed his palm flat against the nearest wall, held it there. "Elliot built this," he said. "Not a question." "Yes," Clara said. "You can tell a man's work by the way he handles the corners." He pressed once more, then dropped his hand. Elliot never left a corner he wasn't satisfied with. He turned and looked at her for a long moment, the way old men looked at young women when what they were actually doing was measuring something invisible, something that had nothing to do with appearance. "You have the papers," he said. "Yes. Both of them." "Both of them." He nodded once, the nod of a man who had been waiting to hear a specific thing and had now heard it. "Sit down, child," he said, though she had a seat and he did not. "And show me." She laid the 1869 certificate on the flat surface of the crate. August looked at it for a long moment without touching it, the way he had looked at the wall, taking it in fully before engaging with it. Then he reached out with his right hand, swollen knuckles, fingers still precise despite the swelling. The hand of a man who had worked stone for 60 years and had the architecture to prove it. He placed his index finger on his own signature. March the 3rd, he said, 1869. Elliot had been on the land since 1867. He wanted the title done properly. Harold Greer and I both witnessed. He looked up. Harold passed in 1878. Which leaves you, Clara said. Which leaves me. He removed his finger from the signature. I have been sitting in Ruth's back storage room since October eating her cooking, which is excellent, but repetitive specifically so that I would be available for this moment. Something in his voice, dry and precise, the humor of a man who found the situation absurd without finding it unimportant. I also, he said, have this. He reached inside the buffalo coat, into the interior breast pocket, and he placed on the surface of the crate beside the certificate a small object. She looked at it. Plaster. A cast. A mold of a right hand, cupped slightly, the way a hand rested when it was at peace. The fingers relaxed. The thumb. The thumb deviated, noticeably, significantly, angled away from its natural axis, set wrong, or rather, set at the angle of a bone that had broken and healed in a direction no one had been able to correct. Stiff, unable to rotate, unable to maintain the pressure required for a continuous curve. We made it in 1869, August said. The same week we signed that certificate. We had just finished the cabin foundation together. 4 days of work. I had spent 4 days watching his hands. The way the thumb changed his grip on the hammer. The way it changed the angle of every stroke he made. He looked at the cast. I told him I wanted to make it. I told him it was a keepsake, a record of a man's work. He paused. He laughed at me, August said. He said I was sentimental. He picked up the cast, turned it once in his large hands. He was right, he said. I am sentimental, but I am also a stone man, and stone men know that some things need to be preserved in physical form, because memory is subject to argument, and plaster is not. He set it back down. Clara looked at the cast, at the deviated thumb, at the angle it held. The M in Mead, 2 strokes, always 2 strokes, because a thumb held at that angle could not sustain continuous pressure through a connected curve. The physical law of a broken bone, precise and unargued. She looked at August. Will you go to Sundance? She said. Will you say to Judge Pwitt what you've just said to me? He looked at her with the expression of a man who had been waiting for a question and was relieved to finally hear it asked. Young woman, he said, I have been eating beans in a storage room for 3 months, for this exact question. He straightened in his seat, all of him, the way a man straightened when something mattered. Yes, she told him what to expect, not the verdict. She could not promise the verdict, but the shape of the fight. Crane's lawyer from Cheyenne. The attack on August's age. His memory. The 3 months in Ruth's back room that would be used against him. The appearance of coordination. The suggestion that a man who hid himself had something to hide. August listened. He listened the way he had looked at the wall, completely, without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. I remember Elliot Mead's hands, he said, because we spent 4 days in the autumn of 1868 laying the foundation of this property's cabin together. I was doing the corner work, and he kept repositioning my stones. Not from arrogance, from accuracy. He could see the load paths better than I could. He paused. His right thumb had been broken the previous winter. It never set in alignment. It affected every gripping motion he made for the rest of his life. He looked at the plaster cast. A hand that signed that forged deed needed to produce a continuous curve on a capital letter. Elliot Mead's hand after the winter of 1867 could not do that. I will state this before any judge in any court in Wyoming Territory, and I will state it with the precision of a man who spent 30 years working stone alongside other men and learned to read their hands the way a reader reads a page. The words settled into the chamber, like stones placed by a careful hand, one by one, each in its right position, Clara folded both papers, returned them to the oilskin pouch, placed the plaster cast carefully beside them, pressed the pouch against her ribs. They made the journey to Sundance in early April. Werner Dunn drove the wagon. August sat in the bed on a folded blanket. Clara sat up front beside Werner. The mud was extraordinary. The kind of mud that Wyoming produced after a winter like this one. Deep and purposeful, as if the ground itself had been storing something and was now releasing it all at once. The wagon wheel sank twice. Both times Werner climbed down without cursing, found a board from the wagon bed, and worked the wheel free with the systematic focus of a man who had learned that cursing did not improve traction. Both times. August watched from the wagon bed with the expression of a man who had seen worse and survived it. Both times. Clara climbed down and helped push. Because waiting was slower, they did not talk much, which was all right. Some journeys did not need conversation. Some journeys needed the sound of horses and mud and wheels and the particular silence of three people who each understood what was at stake and had each chosen separately to be here anyway. Millhaven, then the road south, then the long approach to Sundance. The courthouse was a wood frame building that smelled of sawdust and the accumulated weight of official proceedings. 2 stories, a flag that had not been replaced since the previous spring and showed it. The mud of the main street of Sundance was no better than the road. Different texture, same depth. Clara stepped down from the wagon, looked at the building. All right, she thought. Here we are. Inside, Judge Aldrich Pwitt presided. Lean, deliberate, mid-50s, the reputation in the territory was consistency. He had affirmed Crane's forged transfer in October on the basis of documentation that had been thorough and correctly stamped. He was not a corrupt judge. He was a careful one who had been carefully deceived. The room held more people than it had seats for. Werner's neighbors from the valley filled one side. Families she recognized. The Hendersons. The Oaks' reverend and wife, the wife's cough, finally resolved sometime in February in a shelter built from Werner's diagram on the lee side of their foundation. 3 other families who had traveled through mud and cold to be present for a reason that Clara would not fully understand until later. They had come because the winter had happened, because Werner had drawn a diagram on a flat stone and brought it home and built a shelter from it, because the Hendersons had learned the same thing from Werner, because knowledge had moved outward from her father's underground chamber through Werner's coat pocket and through the valley like water finding its level. And now those people were here, not as witnesses, not as evidence, just as people who knew. Crane was on the other side of the room. His lawyer from Cheyenne, expensive suit. The particular posture of a man accustomed to being the most prepared person in any given room. He arranged papers with a thoroughness that was itself a performance. Look how many papers I have. Look how completely I have anticipated every possible argument. Crane himself looked at the room and found it larger than expected. His face adjusted, almost imperceptibly. But Clara was watching. She saw it. Pwitt reviewed the original forged transfer. Then the challenge she had filed with the clerk 3 days prior. Werner had helped her write it. August had reviewed the language. She had written the final version herself in the underground chamber by lamplight on paper smoothed across the top of the wooden crate with the stove burning at working temperature and the oilskin pouch 3 inches from her right hand. Then Pwitt reviewed the 1869 certificate. He placed it beside the forged document, looked at both. The room went very quiet. The kind of quiet that a room produced when the people in it understood that someone at the front was actually thinking, not performing, not proceeding through a rehearsed sequence, actually looking at 2 pieces of paper and processing what they meant. Pwitt looked up. "Proceed," he said. Crane's lawyer moved with efficiency. The 1869 certificate's chain of custody, it had not been held in the county record office, he noted. It had been in the possession of the claimant. Who was the interested party, which raised obvious questions about the document's integrity. He questioned whether a document held by an interested party constituted independent evidence. Then he turned to August. 78 years of age, he said. Memory subject to the erosions of time. The 3 months spent in Miss Ruth Aldridge's storage room, undisclosed to any official authority. This suggested a degree of coordination, he said, that called his independence into question. He used the word coordination twice. The second time with a small, careful smile. August sat through all of this, still as stone. The kind of stillness that did not come from patience, that came from knowing something, from having what you needed and understanding that the moment to use it had not quite arrived yet. Puig invited August to respond. August rose from his chair, slowly, with the deliberate respect of a man who understood that certain moments required a person to stand upright for them. He did not raise his voice. He had no reason to. The room was already silent. The room had been silent since he stood. I have been working stone since I was 19 years old, he said. I am 78 now. In that time, I have worked alongside perhaps 200 men, in various conditions, in various counties, in various states of this country. He placed his right hand on the table, spread the fingers, looked at them for a moment before looking up. I remember their hands, because hands are how a stone man knows another stone man. The angle of a grip tells you what a man can do, what a man has done, what has been done to him. He reached inside the buffalo coat, set the plaster cast on the table, in front of Puig, where the light from the high courthouse window fell directly on it. I made this cast in 1869, August said, from the right hand of Elliot Raymond Mead. I made it the same week I signed the title certificate as witness. We had spent 4 days laying the cabin foundation on the Mead property together. I watched his hands for 4 days, and what I learned in those 4 days, I will tell this court. The room had stopped breathing, or that was how it felt to Clara, sitting at the table with the oilskin pouch inside her coat, with both documents before Puig and the cast on the table between them, with 29 days of charcoal marks in the dark behind her, with ember gone, with the stove she had built from her father's chosen stones, with the M, always the M. His right thumb, August said, was broken in a stoneworking accident in the winter of 1867. It healed at a deviation from its natural axis, a significant deviation, the kind that affected every gripping motion he made for the rest of his life. He looked at the cast, including the motion of holding a pen. He looked at Crane's lawyer, then at Puig. The signature on the forged transfer was made by a hand that could produce an unbroken curved stroke on a capital letter, specifically the letter M. He did not look at Crane, not once. I will tell this court under any oath it requires that the hand I watched for 4 days in 1868 and worked beside for 15 years after could not have made that stroke, not in 1871, not in 1881, not on any document bearing any date after the winter of 1867. He paused. The hand simply did not have the range of motion. He sat back down. The room held its silence. The particular silence that rooms held when something had been said that everyone present understood to be, in the plain sense of the word, true. Puig looked at the two signatures side by side, at the cast, at August. Crane's lawyer tried twice more. The age argument, the memory argument, a technical challenge to the admissibility of the plaster cast as physical evidence. He made these arguments efficiently, with the competence of someone working from a prepared list, checking boxes. The arguments lost structural integrity as they were made, like a stone wall in which the foundation course had been placed wrong. Each successive course adding weight to a problem that had been there from the beginning. Clara did not speak again after her initial presentation. She did not need to. And then the door of the courtroom opened. Not dramatically, not with force, just opened. The way doors open when someone on the other side of them turned the handle and pushed. A man came in, 56, lean, a coat that was good but had been worn for 2 days of travel without the opportunity to be brushed. mud at the hem, the face of a man who had made a decision somewhere on the road between one county and another and was now in the process of living with it. Clara looked at him, then at Puit at the front of the room. Similar bearing, similar build, but this man's eyes carried something different. The particular look of someone who had driven through mud and cold for 2 days specifically to be in this room. Specifically because he could not stop thinking about a decision he had made in October. Someone near the back of the room said a name, quietly, to the person beside them. Judge Harlan Puit, from Laramie County. Clara filed the distinction. What was relevant, this was the man who had originally stamped the forged transfer, who had reviewed it in October at Crane's request in Sundance, who had pressed his seal into the lower right corner with the authority of someone who trusted that the documentation before him was what it claimed to be. He had been lied to, he had been used, and he had driven through post-northern mud for 2 days because he could not let that stand. He stopped at the edge of the room, looked at the proceedings, at the documents on the table, at August, at Clara, at Puit of Crook County. I apologize for the interruption, he said. His voice was the voice of a man who did not apologize casually, which made the apology mean something. I have testimony that I believe is material to this case. He paused. I reviewed and stamped the transfer document presented by Edmund Crane in October of last year. I did so on the basis of what appeared to be complete and correctly prepared documentation. Another pause. I was deceived. I have spent 4 months understanding how, and I am here to say so under any oath this court requires. No one in the room spoke. Puit of Crook County looked at him for a long moment, then sit down. Harlan Puit sat. Crane's lawyer looked at his papers, as if the papers might have something useful on them. They did not. The testimony that followed was brief. Harlan Puit described the October review, the documentation Crane had presented, the way it had been assembled, thorough, correctly formatted, supported by the verification signature of Sheriff Silas Greer, the county seal already in place, the transfer appearing in every structural detail legitimate. I am a careful judge, he said. I have been a careful judge for 22 years. I was carefully deceived, which required a degree of preparation and coordination that speaks to the intentionality of the deception. He looked at the table. I did not drive 2 days through mud to condemn myself. He looked up. I drove 2 days to correct what my seal was used to accomplish without my knowledge. Crane's lawyer opened his mouth. No, said Puit of Crook County, simply, without heat. The way you said no to something that did not require further explanation. The lawyer closed his mouth. And then, Werner Dunn stood up. He had been sitting in the second row, not at the plaintiff's table, not with Clara, just in the room, because he had a right to be in the room, because he had driven through the same mud and come anyway. He stood up. Nobody asked him to. Clara did not know he was going to do it. She turned when she heard the movement, and she looked at him. This man who had been in a barn coat in February with 2 children wrapped in one blanket, who had calculated, who had told her honestly and without performance that he had made a choice based on arithmetic and called it fear and lived with the difference for 3 months. He stood up and he spoke. My name is Werner Dunn, he said. I farm the claim adjacent to the Meade property. I have a statement that I should have made in October. Puit of Crook County looked at him. I was present on the 12th of September last year at a meeting in the back of the Millhaven Land Office. Present at that meeting, Edmund Crane, and a man named Dillard Cavell from Cheyenne who, I understand, works from a print shop on the eastern side of 4th Street in that city. The room was absolutely still. I witnessed money change hands. I witnessed a document being discussed and a signature being practiced. The amount paid to Cavell was $40. I know the date. I know the location. I know the amount. And I know the name. He paused. Not for effect, because he needed a moment. Because saying a thing that had been held for 3 months required more breath than ordinary speaking. I stayed silent because Edmund Crane holds a debt on my farm. I told myself it was fear. It was not only fear. He looked at his hands, then back up. It was calculation. And I have been wrong about the calculation for 3 months, and I am correcting it now. He sat back down. The room exhaled. Not audibly, not as a collective sound, but the pressure changed. The way pressure changed in the underground chamber when the storm finally broke. When the thing that had been pressing from all directions at once simply stopped. Crane's lawyer did not speak. He had run out of structure. The gavel came down at 2 in the afternoon. The forged transfer nullified. Title restored to its 1869 condition. The original certificate entered into the Crook County record, not as a replacement, as the original. Because it was the original. Because it had always been. Harlan Puett's seal formally withdrawn from the forged document and its record expunged. Edmund Crane referred to the territorial prosecutor on charges of document fraud conspiracy and the unlawful procurement of a judicial stamp. Judge Aldrich Puett noted without elaboration that the court took a serious view of the use of fraudulent instruments to dispossess lawful property holders in Wyoming territory. He noted it once. He did not repeat himself. The room emptied slowly. Crane sat at his table for a long time after the gavel, his hands folded, his lawyer packing papers with the efficiency of a man moving on, the particular efficiency of someone who was already calculating the next case. Crane sat, and then he rose and walked out, through the door, into the April mud of Sundance, without speaking to anyone. He did not look at Clara. She did not need him to. Outside the courthouse, Werner stood near the wagon, hands in his coat pockets, looking at the street, the mud, the thin April sky. Clara came to stand beside him. For a moment, they were just two people standing in mud after a long winter. "Cavell," she said, "they'll go to Cheyenne." "They will. He'll be found." "He will." Werner looked at the sky. $40, he said. "That's what it cost." "That's what it cost him," Clara said. "We'll see what it costs the rest of them." A pause. "Your farm," she said. "The debt." "Crane's affairs will be in the territorial prosecutor's hands now." Werner almost smiled. Again, it arrived, and this time it stayed a moment longer before retreating. "I don't think he'll be calling notes due for a while." "No," Clara said. "I don't think he will." August came out of the courthouse with Ruth's arm in his, moving slowly but without apology. The buffalo coat, the good hat, the cast in his coat pocket where it had been all morning, where it would go back to, where it belonged. He looked at Clara. "Your father," he said, "would have enjoyed today, in his particular way." "What way is that?" quietly, August said. From a distance, with no expression on his face, and everything he needed to say said already. Clara looked at the hill to the west, at the horizon in that direction, at the long pale winter sky above it. "Yes," she said, "that's how he was." "I know." August looked at her for a moment longer. Then he let Ruth guide him to the wagon. She did not celebrate. Not because there was nothing to celebrate, but because the land was still there. The cabin roof still needed repair, the corner of the barn, the south fence line where two posts had heaved in the freeze, the entire south-facing section of the property where the drainage slope told her the soil was ready for seed and the seed was not going to plant itself. She went home and got to work. The spring came the way Wyoming springs always came. Not gently, not as a gift, as a negotiated settlement between the cold that had held everything for 5 months and the sun that was prepared to insist. Snow melted from south-facing slopes in thin, clear channels. The creek broke with a sound like the valley clearing its throat. The first week of March brought mud, which was its own kind of beauty. After 5 months of white, the color of dark, wet earth was the most vivid thing she had seen in longer than she could clearly remember. The hummock above the underground chamber was indistinguishable from the surrounding hillside. The entrance slab, replaced and settled back, looked exactly as it had always looked. A section of slope, rock and soil and the root system of a pine tree doing what pines did. She did not fill in the chamber, did not seal the entrance, did not treat it as something finished. Over the following years, she improved it. A proper stone chimney to replace the hollowed log flue. A small south-facing window cut through the hillside with great effort over one long autumn. A shelf along the east wall for books. The temperature in the main chamber held at 48 through every summer. Every winter, every season that arrived with the regularity of physics and required nothing of the stone to sustain it. Each September, when the air began to carry the first suggestion of what was coming, people came to the Mead property, not in the desperate manner of that first winter, not half frozen in barn coats with children wrapped in one blanket. They came deliberately, with their tools, with their families, with the specific attention of people acquiring knowledge they intended to use. Clara taught each group the same principles in the same order. Cold sink first, because cold air was heavy and it settled and you needed somewhere deliberate for it to go. Then the firebox, then ventilation, low intake, high exhaust, never reversed, always test the draw before you light the fire. Then the entrance insulation, then the heated stone system for sleeping. She kept her voice level, her explanations precise, moving from principle to application without ornamentation. And at the end, every time, draw it back for me, from memory. When they drew it back accurately, good. Now teach the next person who comes to your door. The knowledge moved outward. Third-generation copies of a diagram she had first drawn on a flat stone in the dark in February, running through the valley, through neighboring counties. Families who had never met Clara Mead, building their winter shelters from principles they had received from someone who had received them from someone who had stood in an underground chamber and watched a woman draw with charcoal on limestone. The knowledge saved people she would never know. In winters she would not live to see. August Aldred lived until he was 91 years old. He spent his last years in the unhurried manner of a man who had done what he came to do. The plaster cast of Elliot Mead's hand sat on the shelf above his bed in Ruth's house until the end. When Ruth asked him once why he kept it there, he said, "Because it reminds me that a man's suffering can become the thing that saves his daughter. And that is worth looking at every morning." Ruth closed the store eventually, moved to be with her daughter's family further east. Before she left, she came to say goodbye to Clara on a clear October morning. They stood in the yard in the early cold. "My father told me once," Ruth said, "that Elliot Mead was the best stone man he ever worked beside. He said Elliot could look at a wall and see whether it would stand in 20 years. Clara looked at the hill above them, at the barely visible outline of the entrance slab against the slope, at the thin shadow of the vent pipe above it. "He was right about most things," she said. "He just never explained himself until after the fact." Ruth smiled, a real smile, the kind that arrived without announcement. "No," she said, "he really didn't." They stood there a moment longer, in the particular comfort of two women who had each kept something important and survived the keeping of it. Then Ruth turned and walked back toward Millhaven, and Clara turned back to the land that had always been hers. She worked it for another 30 years. The cabin her father had built in 1868 held. Her hands grew thicker at the joints, the skin thinned over knuckles that had absorbed 4 decades of Wyoming weather. Her eyes stayed clear. Her posture stayed straight. She never acquired the habit of explaining herself to people who had not yet earned the explanation. On a cold night in March of 1912, she died in her sleep, in the cabin her father had built, in the bed positioned beside the window that looked west toward the hill. She was 56 years old. The death was unremarkable in its mechanics. A heart that had worked reliably for more than 5 decades simply ceased to do so, and remarkable in every other sense. Because the woman who died was not the sum of a legal case or a winter survived. She was the carrier of a specific kind of knowledge that had moved through a community and changed it in ways no deed of title could measure. Through her hands and her voice and the flat limestone diagrams she had drawn in the dark and required every person to redraw from memory before they left. She left no will. The property passed through several hands over the following decades. The cabin roof finally gave way sometime in the early 1940s. By 1950, nothing remained above ground except the stone foundation, the base of the chimney, and the outline of where the barn had stood. The land looked like land that had been empty for a long time. Millhaven, Wyoming, December 1897. 15 years after that April courthouse. 15 years after the gavel. Silas Greer picked up his pen. He had set it down 3 hours earlier when the fire had burned low and the cold had crept in under the door and the snow had begun to fall outside. He had sat for those 3 hours in the chair by the window, not sleeping, not quite, thinking. He was 61 years old. His knuckles were thicker than they used to be. His hair had completed its journey from gray to white sometime in the past year, and he had not noticed the exact moment it happened, the way most changes came, without announcement, until one day you looked in a mirror and the change was simply done. He picked up the pen, looked at the page, at what he had written, at the story of a woman in a winter in a piece of paper in what lived underground waiting. He wrote the last thing. I have been wrong about one thing my whole life, which is that I thought the measure of a person was what they did when things were easy. It is not. The measure of a person is what they build before the trouble arrives, what they set into the ground when no one is asking them to, what they trust will hold when the worst of it comes. Elliot Mead built something underground for a daughter who did not yet know she would need it. Clara Mead found it and used it and taught everything she learned from it to anyone who came to her door. I signed a false document. I knew it was false. I signed it anyway. And I have spent 16 years learning what it costs to choose wrong and watching what it looks like when someone chooses right. The stone remembers. That is what I know now. Long after the paper rots and the deed fades and the men who held the pens are gone. The stone remembers what it was built to hold. He set down the pen. Outside the window, the snow had covered everything. The main street of Millhaven, the flat-fronted buildings, the church at the western end, the livery at the eastern, and to the west, barely visible through the dark and the white, the hill, rising as it always had, holding what it held. He closed the journal and let the fire go cold. The journal itself survived him by many years, as stone survives most things. It passed from his daughter's keeping to a county archive in Sundance, where it sat in a wooden box alongside other documents from the territory period, largely unread, waiting with the particular patience of written things for someone to open it and recognize what it contained. The hill waited too. In the summer of 1951, a 12-year-old boy named Levi Broward was clearing brush from the western slope above what had been the Mead property, now Broward land, for going on 20 years, when his boot heel caught something solid beneath the overgrowth. He pulled back the grass with both hands. A flat stone, large, fitted into the hillside with a precision that did not look like accident. That did not look like weather. That looked like intention. He called his father. They worked the slab free together, a fence post as lever, the stone grinding against the earth that had held it for decades. A sound that Levi would remember his whole life. Not loud, just final. The sound of something long closed opening. The air that came up was cool. 50 degrees. Steady. The same temperature it had been in July 1870 when a man named Elliot Mead had stood on this hillside and explained to his daughter that the ground remembered August and January both, that 4 feet below the frost line. Nothing changed. Levi went down first. His father handed him a flashlight through the entrance. The beam swept the chamber walls, joints tight and straight after 70 years of freeze-thaw cycles above and 50-degree constancy below. The small stove in the northeast corner. cold for decades but sitting on its base with the assurance of something built by a person who understood what they were building and expected it to outlast them. The wooden crate against the far wall, lid intact. Levi opened it. Oilcloth, stiff with age, but sound. His father climbed down and they opened it together. Inside a tin cup, a whetstone, a folded piece of brown paper that turned out to be a diagram, lines still visible letters marking the pipes, and in a separate lower compartment, the oilskin pouch. His father opened it. His lips moved slightly as he read in the flashlight's beam. Reading slowly, the way you read something when you understand that it requires the time. Then he looked at his son. "This land," he said, and had to stop because the sentence was larger than the next word could carry. He tried again. "A woman lived here. She kept this land through a winter that killed cattle and froze creeks to the bottom and broke the roofs of houses. She kept it with what her father had left her underground. And she won. In court. With a plaster cast of a dead man's hand and an old stoneworker who remembered how a broken thumb changed a signature. He held the certificate up. The light caught it. And when she won, she put this back in the ground." Levi looked at the walls, the ceiling, the stove, the shelf along the east wall where something had once held books and now held only the outline of where books had been. The cold sink trench along the perimeter, the ventilation pipes above, still clear, still breathing. He felt the air, 50 degrees, in July. "Why didn't she take it with her?" he said. "The document, when she won." His father looked at the pouch, at the walls, at the steps leading back up to the surface. He thought about it, for a long moment, with the seriousness the question deserved, the way you thought about things that were worth thinking about properly. "Because the stone was safer," he said at last. "It was always safer." He folded the oilcloth back over the documents with care, set the pouch in its compartment, closed the crate. They climbed back out into the Wyoming summer, which was bright without apology, which did not distinguish between the living and the gone, which fell on the south-facing slope of the hill the same way it had always fallen, warming the earth, which would hold it, through the winter coming, and the one after that, and every winter after. The door slab went back into place. The hill looked as it always had, a slope of grass rising toward a sky that held everything equally. And below it, in the constant cool, in the 50-degree dark that had not changed in 80 years, the ground remembered, as ground always did, as stone always would. Long after the paper faded and the names were forgotten, and the men who had tried to take the land were dust, the stone remembered what it had been trusted to hold, and it held.